Well, welcome to In Conversation with Patrick Gale. My name's Ian Tunbridge. I'm chair of the Charles Causley Trust. Today we're sitting in Charles Causley's sitting room in 2 Cyprus Well in Launceston, Charles Causley's old house, which the Trust now uses as a base for artists in residence, and even cultural visitors can come and stay here for the week if you wish. I was taught by Charles Causley, and the Trust seeks to maintain his memory, but also to support new artists, new creatives. It also seeks to support young people in the town with poetry competition. We also have an international poetry competition. We're also seeking generally to help the town recognise the immense cultural resource that Charles Causley gives in terms of people visiting the town. But today we're here to celebrate the new book of Patrick Gale, Mother's Boy, which talks about Charles Causley's early life, his relationship with his mother, his time in the Navy, and his return to Cornwall after the war. But this is going to be a general chat, and Patrick and I are going to chew over a whole set of issues which I hope you will find of interest. Well, Patrick, it's great to talk again because in the early stages of when you were planning the book, I know we had quite an interesting chat and speculated all sorts of outrageous things and so on. And it's really great to see that the book has now come to fruition.
Yes, well, you were a huge help, in particular with the Causley family tree, helping me work out just how many Bartlett siblings there were, but also little details like the fact that both Charles's both Laura's parents had been born in the Launceston workhouse illegitimately. Yeah. And that was such a useful bit of, unwitting on your part, but a useful bit of character motivation for me. So. Well,
I must say, you've produced an absolutely brilliant book. I mean, I thought it was a delight to read. I really loved it.
I had so much help from people in Launceston who knew Charles and knew Laura, who just told me stories that, if anything, I had too much detail and I had to take a lot of it out. But I'm really pleased to hear it rang true for you.
But it must have been a magna piece of work you had to do in terms of the detail and the research and so on. And I'm really interested to know, what sources you brought together in terms of this.
Well, as you can see from the acknowledgements at the end, they're pretty far reaching. So obviously there was the very local research, talking to people, walking the streets of Launceston, looking at old photographs. But I also had to learn how to do laundry without a washing machine in great detail. In fact, when my editor read the first draft of this, she said, I can see in this book laundry is going to be to the book what ploughing was to a place called Winter. We will now take 60% of it out because there was so much detail about Laura's work. But I wanted that to ring very true, the fact that she was a labourer, that what she did was hard physical work. But also I had to do masses of research to do with Charles's naval career and coding in particular, because coding having been a top secret activity, there is very little trace left of that strand of naval history. The Navy destroyed things obsessively as they went along, and even as part of his training, every lesson with Charles when he was learning to be a coder ended with all the men in the room putting all their paperwork into the fire. So that was a struggle. I got there in the end, but it was, I found a codex machine, but then the only man who could be found who knew how to work one had Alzheimer's. Things like that. I got there in the end, but the Imperial War Museum was a huge help. They found me a bit of oral history. They had a recording of a very old guy who had been a coder in the Navy, and his tapes were unbelievably boring, but every now and then he would give me 20 minutes of pure gold. Yeah. So I just sat there kind of half dozing with my pen in my hand.
And I mean, the other thing, Charles Causley was always very clear that, he didn't have a biography because it's all there in the poems, which on one hand, is a very clear signal, but on the other hand, the poems don't sit in a chronological order. And I just wondered how much you managed to draw out from individual poems.
Oh, a lot. I mean, it's a typical dusty answer on Charles's part to say, it's all in the poems. Because yes, it is, but it's in code. And I think you have to read the poems alongside a biography and alongside a big pinch of salt, because he hides things. because he was a deeply private man.
He was.
And I think he took on board one of the first lessons he had in poetry from Siegfried Sassoon, who, in one of the letters that, thank heavens, is preserved in the Causley archive, Sassoon writes to him, and I quote it almost word for word in the book, how a poem is about far more than just the skin of it, that there are meanings beneath that. So I think Charles got into this very early habit of ambiguity. So very few of his poems are about just one thing, and they can nearly all be read on three levels.
Yeah. Well, I'll come back to that a little later, because I think there's some you've unearthed some really interesting clues to the depths of Charles Causley's private life, and I think that's a fascinating element of the book. But I mean, in a way, the story to me starts off and really hits the nail on the head in terms of the way that you describe Charles Causley's early childhood. Now, I mean, that's not something that's well documented, yet I felt reading that, my God, that's almost like my childhood. I mean, these things that, the little lad that learns to read early on, he goes off to school with his specs and he hates football and he's bullied, yet he's very bright.
Yes.
And his mother is recognising that he's bright, yet at the same time it's also a fragility for him and so on. I mean, how did you work all that through? Because I mean, I thought it was absolutely perfect in terms of what an awful lot of kids that don't like football experience. I mean, tell me about how you went at that.
Well, I mean, initially I was really daunted because Charles is, obviously is a real person with a great legacy and many admirers. So I approached the subject with trepidation. But then I began to find these things that I had in common with him, and that was my way in. And I was bullied at school. I was hopeless at sport. I learnt the piano very early on, and learnt to read before I started school. So those gave me confidence in then sort of daring to inhabit Charles. But again, his poems helped, because both his poems and the numerous little autobiographical essays he wrote much later in life, if you stitch them together, you get this portrayal of this bullied, watchful child, and in the photographs, he's often slightly to one side. Yeah. I think this is one of the things that defined him. He speaks for himself in one of those essays as being on the edge of things. It suited him to be on the edge, looking in, rather than to be in the thick of things. But he developed a very, very efficient series of personae, which enabled him to interact and to perform and appear to be outgoing, appear to be extrovert. The most obvious of which, I think, is his playing the piano in 2 dance bands locally. Yeah. And I thought long and hard about this. I thought, you were quite a shy person, and I'm deep down a shy person, and I recognised immediately, but you realise, Charles, that by learning the piano and then volunteering to play in these bands, you would be going to parties without actually having to interact as a party
Spot on,
person.
yes, I sympathise with that. I know exactly what you mean.
So there he was, making a noise, being in the thick of things, but not having to dance with anybody, not having to do any of the things that make parties terrifying. Yeah. And yet he would get a bottle of beer.
Yeah, and a degree of popularity, because you're the guy that's playing the piano that's giving everybody a great time.
And similarly, in his diaries, which he kept in they were top secret diaries, because in the Navy you really weren't meant to do this. He describes how he has this, and I put this in the novel, this moment of breakthrough socially in the Navy, when quite by chance they realise he can play the piano. And suddenly one night in Skegness, there he is entertaining a whole load of soldiers and sailors. But again, he's entertaining them. He's in this role where he is at once the focus of the attention, but also safely apart from it.
Yeah. But I mean, this business of the piano, I mean, I know when we first met, we speculated on how did Laura manage to find money for a piano? Yeah. You've got a poor widow washerwoman.
Earning pennies,
yet he gets a piano. Yeah. And I think, the fact you identified really well how he gets the lessons. And I mean, I think that's pretty typical Lance.
That was a good guess. But
I thought
there'd have been a Cornish trade-off.
That was a trade-off.
Yeah, so I imagine the vicar's daughter saying, well, I'll teach him the piano if he sings in the choir. Which would also explain why Charles carried on singing in the choir, even when he had fallen out of love with going to church. Yeah. So the process of putting Charles together in the book was a combination of detective work, sort of inspired guesswork,
Yeah. So, but I mean, what we haven't really said very much about this morning is Laura, and I'm really interested at the way that you've woven the picture of Laura Causley, because I mean, there's lots of stuff in the poems and in the writing and so on, and all sorts of other stuff about Charles Causley that you've had a rich seam there that you've been able to mine in many respects. But I mean, Laura Causley, by comparison, is a bit of a cipher in terms of what's known about her and so on. Yet you painted a really great picture, I thought, of the built up over successive chapters.
I'm thrilled you say it. I mean, I had to rather infer Laura from the poems, because I feel she was clearly the primary influence on Charles when he was growing up. And so I suspect her voice was partly his voice, the voice he began to write with and speak with. And country wisdom. She wasn't a great reader, she liked romances, but she knew a thing or two about human life, which she would have imparted. And I was also interested in Laura the labourer, so I looked very hard at what she did for a living and what that would have entailed and how hard it would have been. And again, I thought that would have shaped her character. And the desperate loss of Charlie, her husband, really, who was never the breadwinner. He didn't live long enough to be the breadwinner. So by today's standards, they were a one-parent family, really.
And I thought you painted so well, those last ill years of Charlie.
Well, TB, I mean, that was completely fascinating because, of course, I was writing that during the early days of COVID when we were all completely terrified and washing cardboard when we got back from the shop and so on. And I was then reading a manual from the 1920s on how to care for your TB patient in your family. And one of the things that sprang out at me was the dusting. You were all told to dust and dust and dust. And suddenly I understood why my grandmother and mother must have been so obsessed with dusting. Because it was a hygiene thing. It was a way of stopping tuberculosis spreading. And then there was the Blue Henry. I knew about spittoons. I didn't know until I started researching the book about these little portable spittoons that TB patients were encouraged to carry with them. And I found an example of one called a Blue Henry, which was a bit like a milk and magnesia bottle and with a silver cap that flipped up. And I thought actually a 5-year-old boy with a father with TB would have become obsessed by the Blue Henry, this thing that his dad took out of his pocket and spat into discreetly and tapped it back in. It's ghastly, but it was a fact of their life, and it's something that I think Charles, it was probably unbelievably painful for him, and therefore it doesn't get dealt with for a very long time. And there's just that one poem about the breaking of the news of his father's death and his own underreaction to it, apparently, as a child. But I felt that was very telling, and there must, in those sort of 5 or 6 years of having a daddy, that must have shaped him. And just as we talked about Grace as being one of several surrogate mothers he sought out, I think he must have spent his life looking for a father figure here and there. I think one of the things that's so moving when he becomes an established poet is seeing this circle of very authoritative male poets who befriend him. So obviously Ted Hughes, but also Seamus Heaney, and that I don't know. It's all extrapolation. We can't know for sure. But I really wanted to go to the heart of what it would have meant for Laura losing Charlie so young and then having to cope on her own and trying to make ends meet. But also, in pursuing Laura's story, I was terrified she wouldn't have enough story. I knew Charles was going to go off to war and have this big adventure. But then I looked at what happened in Launceston during the Second World War, and I thought, well, she's going to have too much story if I'm not careful. Because there was so much going on here, not just all the soldiers, but then the GIs coming from the States, the race mutiny, and then the POWs. It was a really, really interesting town. And I was fascinated at the economic transformation of the town briefly during the war. Yes, the war was traumatic, but my word, it made some people here very rich indeed. And it changed all the social structures.
But I thought you picked up so well on one of the interviews from Charles Causley where he said, my mother was one of the most tolerant people that I could imagine, And I thought you I don't know whether you took that in terms of two of the chapters in the book where, first of all, there's the dinner with the Black American GI, and then of course her interrelationship with the German POWs.
Yes.
And in both cases, you could think, well, small town, I ain't having nothing to do with black men, or that's the Germans, we're going to give them a hard time. Yet she was very open and understanding in both of those cases. And I thought, I mean, did you deliberately pick those two as a means of showing that Laura Causley was a very tolerant individual?
Yes, because I knew Charles was, and he must have got it from her. And also, it was just history. I realised that Trediden Road, where they were living, that is where the German POWs made the playground, directly opposite Laura's house.
Right.
So of course she'd have gone out with a tray of tea.
Yeah.
She would have encountered them. They were all over the town. Yeah. And she had evacuee boys living with her at the time. They would have been fascinated by the POWs. So it wasn't a great stretch. I mean, the Black GI friendship, I thought, when I looked into the treatment of the Black GIs here, and I discovered it was just one line in Kate Waren's book about how they were horribly shut up in camps in America first, hardly ever given leave compared to their white equivalents. And then when the same happened here, it was like a powder keg. But the one thing they could do was go to church. So I thought, okay, Laura's church was the kind of low church socially compared to St Mary's. So they would probably have gone down the hill from Pennygillen to there. But I guessed that. It's an inspired guess.
Well, I think an entirely plausible guess. But I mean, the whole GI thing's really interesting. I mean, the shootout in Launceston Town Square, where
the bullet holes are
you
still
can still
there.
see the bullet holes and so on. I mean, is a quite remarkable event, and I think is still quite unexplored in terms of what the general town reaction must have been to that, which must have been quite shocking.
Well, and I suspect, as the Cornish still do, there was resentment of any rules being imposed on them from outside. And
absolutely.
The fact that the Americans came along and said, we have segregation, therefore you are going to have segregation, wouldn't have gone down at all well.
Gone down a lead balloon.
Yeah.
Bad enough our London folk coming down here
exactly.
and what to do.
Not these Americans. So, that was interesting.
Yeah, indeed, yes. And I mean, we then come, almost to the end of the book. He comes back home and he just sort of settles. Well, I mean, here we are in Cyprus Well and so on.
Well, they don't move here in the book. They're still at Trediden,
it's very
this
much
is waiting for them.
It's awaiting for them, and certainly, I mean, when I and particularly my mother knew Charles Causley and his mother, they were here, and I mean, it was very, and certainly when he was teaching me, they were here, and that picture. That's in Jane Dark's wonderful film of him coming down the road with his briefcase. That was exactly, the end of each teaching day for him. And I thought, it must have been a very close relationship that had built up there, which I think, you explain so well in the book as being something that had evolved over many decades in a way. And it explains, I think, so much about that phase of Charles Causley's life.
Well, and this house, although it doesn't feature in the book, really helped me imagine their relationship because it's so intimate. It's small.
Yeah.
And Laura has her chair, Charles has his chair, she has her own, he has his. Yes. And when you go up to bed here, you suddenly realise, well, their beds were so close they could have chatted from pillow to pillow through this very thin wall. And that was an immense comfort in a way. When I stayed here halfway through researching the book for a week and just walked the walks they'd have walked and tried to see all the locations Charles mentions in the diaries. But the thing that really helped me was just picturing their life together at home and how that had been shaped by years of respecting one another's privacy, actually. Yeah. Precisely because they were living on top of each other. Just like sailors in a tiny mess on a battleship, they would have been very careful to respect each other's privacy, to keep their own territories within the space.
But I mean, I guess that also she must have become quite dependent on Charles, particularly as she aged. And I would love, and there's another unanswered question. I would love to have been a fly on the wall when, after he's come back, he's got his job as a teacher, he's starting to get some royalties in, he knows he can go away every summer and go somewhere interesting, exotic. How does he explain that to Mother? because certainly during term time and for the great majority of the year, there's a very fixed routine here that he gets up, he goes to school. Certainly when she's older, then a carer comes in. But I mean, she's pottering around in the house.
I bet she was immensely proud and loved being able to say to friends, "Oh, Charles is in Athens this summer," and we can see the house is full, not just of knickknacks, but of things he clearly brought back for her or posted back for her, and she'd have shown those off. I mean, after all, we're talking about the dawn of mass tourism. It was still quite an adventure to go abroad. Yeah. And I suspect the combination of that and hearing him referred to as Mr. Causley must have given her a great glow in the heart, really. Yeah. When you remember what a hard childhood she would have had and how she was raised to think that the poverty line was not far, just out of sight, really, and a threat constantly. To have a son with such a stable job, a job for life, as it would have been. In
Absolutely.
Those days.
Well, still is to quite a large extent if you can manage to stick it that long. and I love the way in which you started to develop within the book these presumably fictional characters. I mean, Aggie, Mrs. Netley, Mrs. Bracewell, and so on, who I thought were encapsulated beautifully the different kinds of
town
people,
types.
Town types.
But I took my cue for all of them from Charles's poems. I was so not surprised to discover an unfinished novel in Charles's archive, because psychologically he was a novelist in that he was brilliant at skewering characters. All I really did was to lift some characters out of the poems and make them flesh. So Aggie Trelaw is an interesting one.
That's the one that really fascinates me.
One of my favourite poems of Charles's is one, Demolition Order, in which one of the town prostitutes' houses is being demolished to make way for council flats. And we know this happened, the council flats are still there.
Yeah.
So I was able to extrapolate from that, okay, so Aggie Trelaw's place was probably there. Almost certainly she was about the same age as Laura. So that almost certainly the two of them would have known each other in primary school. I wonder what the real Aggie Trelaw's story was. So I combined that with Charles' repeated statement that for all that she was quite formidable, his mother was remarkably unjudgmental. Yeah. So she was Christian in the best sense. She was Christ-like as opposed to Christian in that she withheld judgment and just helped people. So I then thought, and she was also very sensible and practical. So she might well have done laundry for Aggie Trelaw because she'd have paid very well, especially in the 1940s when this place was overrun with sailors. The ladies of ill repute did very well, thank you. And all those details, they're not really made up by me. I've sort of, it's a mixture of winnowing Charles's poems and chatting to locals and putting just enough there to be recognisable. The tricky bit, the two really tricky sort of diplomatic bits, were how to deal with Charles's boyhood friends, most of whom died in the war. And I didn't want to just put them in with their real names, although I couldn't resist using Ginger. There was a Ginger. So I've combined them into two totemic figures, one of whom begins as the bullying butcher's son who gives Charles a black eye, but ends up being a kind of friend. And the other of whom is a combination of several rather clingy friends from his teens and 20s. And the thing I really was fascinated about by them was their politics, because in the 30s they were properly left-wing. And they all complained that you couldn't be left-wing in Launceston. All you could be was a woolly liberal. But I then started thinking, well, I wonder how much of this Laura picked up. Maybe Laura read the copies of George Orwell after Charles had finished with them. Who knows?
Well, I mean, again, I thought that hung together as being absolutely spot on. I mean, first of all, the unpopular boy, which I think, is a good theme, who would have a small but faithful group of friends, like-minded, and then this. I wrote these two quotes down from that bit in the book, which you've just mentioned about Launceston. Impossible to be properly left-wing in Launceston. Yeah. And the other
probably
thing,
still true today.
Probably still quite true today. And Plymouth, in a city like Plymouth, it was easier to believe that things might change. And I thought those were two really telling sentences about small town life in Cornwall. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that the kind of big unanswered question which powered the book in part for me was why Charles came back. Because when you read his private diaries from the 20s and 30s, he hates Launceston. He can't wait to escape. His mother is driving him mad. He finds it petty, small-minded, too conservative by far, class-ridden.
Yeah.
He wants out. I mean, if you went up to Charles in 1935 and said, where do you want to be? He'd have said New York or Berlin.
Yeah.
And yet, after the great trauma of the war, he chooses to come back and lead this extraordinarily quiet life. So that was something that really fascinated me. This active sea change, this choice to come back here, live with mother, and be Mr. Causley, the teacher.
But that doesn't surprise me at all.
Right.
Because I think this is the classic dilemma of so many people brought up in Cornwall. I see it in my own life. I see it in my daughter's life today, that you love Cornwall at one level. At another level, you realise it is incredibly limiting and you need to get away. And after you've been away for a while, you know you want to come back. Yeah. Sooner or later, you want to come back. I mean, I was fortunate in that I was able to get a job at what was then Plymouth Polytechnic, and I could come back. And people said, "Why do you want to come back?" Well, you know, there's this thing in the Cornish psyche that says, "This is where I belong."
Yes, I belong to be.
But you also realise that if you just come back and you just slip into small town mentality, and that's why he went away every summer. I mean, he got the money because he was getting the royalties. Yes. He went away every summer, and I think he saw that. But of course, the other thing that I think brought him back was this loyalty to Laura. Mother was there.
Yeah.
Mother was the if you like the machinery which had that plus the Navy had given him the opportunity. Well, she got him the piano.
Yes.
Yeah. She'd nurtured him. She'd brought him up. She'd had faith in him. She said, "You're a bright lad, Charles. There's things you can do." And he had Nate demobbed from the Navy. He had to come back. Yeah. But also this business at the same time, and I think you picked this out. So the other crucial point in the book to me is the suit and the job.
Oh, yes.
Now, how many working class, bright young people in the 1930s, 40s, or even 50s, come to that, had to leave school after they'd done their school certificate, their O-levels in essence, because there was no money in the family to be able to pay for them to stay on. They had to start making a contribution, and already parents would have thought, well, what can they do? Yeah. And an awful lot of that, I think, is that he wasn't alone.
No,
in terms of
I'm
that
sure.
sort
I
of
mean,
thing.
It's terribly easy to resent Laura for having, got him the job, taken him out of school, but I think in the long term, I think he was probably grateful to her because it made him who he was, which was not a member of the establishment.
Yeah.
He was, one of the things that makes him so interesting as a 20th century poet is he hadn't gone to university. He had 2 years at teacher training college, but it wasn't the same in class-ridden England as Seamus Heaney and Ted Hughes. And these actually, they could afford to be rebellious or whatever because they were very well connected. Charles had none of those connections. And that suited him, I think.
I think so. And also, I mean, you look at an awful lot of creatives and they produce fantastic work because things have not been totally easy.
Yeah.
And for him, I mean, I think he genuinely did quite like being a teacher. And certainly at that time, there wasn't a national curriculum, and he could really grow his school kids through his own way of delivering learning.
And also, don't you think one of the big things he got out of teaching was he was redeeming his own education?
Yeah.
Because school hadn't been a nice place for him. And by all accounts, every child who was taught by him had their life, at least when they were in his class, school was fun and exciting. But
look, I mean, it's been fascinating talking all of this through again, and I mean, I'm delighted to see the book now in print,
in the flesh,
and I think people are going to have a great read in terms of this.
Well, I hope so, and already I'm my heart glows when people who read the book for the first time send me an email and say, I have to be honest, I'd never heard of Charles Causley. And when I got to the end of the book and read your acknowledgements and saw that he was real, I immediately Googled Charles Causley poems. And I just feel, well, my job is done.
Well, it's in itself, it's a great book, and I think it's another masterpiece from your pen, which follows on from some other great books. But I mean, can I also say, as chair of the Charles Causley Trust, this is very important to us as well, because you've just said, this is raising interest in Charles Causley, and as inevitably is the case with a deceased poet, they go into a quiet period and then they get rediscovered. And I think you are giving us in the Trust an enormous gift with this book, in that it's resurrecting a lot of the interests which we as a Trust seek to keep alive. And I think also it's an immense gift you're giving to the town of Launceston. It's full of history, it's full of beautiful buildings.
And yet, Charles isn't yet sufficiently in the heart of the town, and I'd like to see
Well, and that's certainly one of the things as a Trust, we're really keen to help the town. What I want them to be doing on Friday evenings, when they see the trees of, are we nearly there yet? They say, let's stop in Launceston for the night, that's far enough. Let's go and see all the Charles Causley stuff, let's visit the castle, let's visit the fantastic church at St Mary Magdalene. And that Launceston can really make something of itself, I think, drawing in Causley together with all the other great things. And I think your book is a really important contribution to what we as a Trust are now really seeking to do for the future, which is we're not a dead poet society. We're very much a live organisation. We want to sponsor new work, and the fact that people can come here as artists in residence to this house. But it's about a much bigger picture in my book, in terms of giving Launceston, which is something that actually builds up its economic prosperity. And
here's hoping.
You are helping considerably in that. I mean, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ian.